What do we mean by inequalities? Why is it important to talk about the plural when we mention the concept of unequal things? What unequal things exist and are relevant in a context of a country that has very different realities in the North and South or between different social groups? In his new book, Inequalities, Why It Would Benefit All of Us to Live in a More Equal Country, Dr. Raymundo Campos Vazquez discusses these issues for the case of Mexico. Raymundo is a professor at the Center for Economic Studies at the Colegio de México, and he's one of the foremost inequality experts in the country. He's extremely knowledgeable about very many different dimensions of inequality, and he discusses them all in his excellent new book. And they reach from economic inequalities over gender inequalities, ethno-racial inequalities, and importantly, as he argues, regional disparities. North and South in the country are completely different. They live in different worlds, we could say, in different countries almost. And they are in the danger of literally living in different countries, he argues, if the situation as it is now is not addressed soon and something is done about these extreme inequalities in the country. Join us for a new episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. And we're very happy to have Raymundo here today to discuss with us the benefits of trying to go towards a more equal country. As he argues very convincingly in his book, talents are distributed equally across the country. The problem is opportunities are not. And the result of that is that the country is unequal, both across individuals and across social groups. Not a very sustainable future. Let's hear what he has to say about his new book. Raymundo, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Alice. I'm very happy to be here with you.
We are very happy to have you here, a specialist in inequalities, and we will be talking about your book, Inequalities. We would like you to explain, maybe first, for starters, before we go into the details of what the book is about, why the title is Inequalities, and what do you mean by that?
Yes, excellent. So the book is titled Inequalities, Why Do We Benefit for a More Egalitarian Country, or something like that. It's edited by Grano de Sal and Centro Espinosa Iglesias. And I'm very happy that it was just published. And basically, we were discussing actually in my editors and I about the title, whether to include the singular and the plural. And I think they were very convincing that it was more obvious that the title should be in plural, given that I describe in the book different inequalities, and they were right, of course. And I think that is correct because I talk about inequalities early in life, inequalities in adolescence, inequalities in the labor market, inequality of opportunity, wealth inequality, income inequality, and discrimination, that is a form of inequality. So I think I talk about several types of inequalities that we face in Mexico. That's why it's titled in plural.
Of course, we here at the Inequalities channel agree that it's a plural definition because there are multiple dimensions to inequality. But what would you say, considering this very broad spread of inequality dimensions, different topics, what unites them or what brings them together? Why do you think it's useful to have a book that deals with all of these different dimensions?
Yes, because what the purpose I had with the book was to show Mexican society that we face several inequalities and that these inequalities need a multidimensional response. It's very hard to come up with one solution to a problem that has many different phases. So we need a multidimensional approach to decrease all the inequalities we have. So what I argue in the book is that we face these different inequalities of different kinds, that Mexico has suffered these inequalities for a long time, and that we need to start doing things differently if we want to decrease them. And I go further to try to convince the reader that these inequalities are very bad for everyone, not only for poor people, because many people think that inequality is a problem related to poverty. But I mean, it is related, but it's not the whole issue. And what I try to convince the reader is that the inequalities we face hurt everyone in society. And so I think that's the main argument, that all these inequalities are hurting Mexican society, and we need to decrease them. And if we decrease them, we're going to be much better off.
And your argument goes even further and says we need to decrease them now because there's an imminent threat. Can you get a little bit into that line
Yes.
and what the book is actually about?
So I talk about many different inequalities, and one of them is the regional part in Mexico. So Mexico is divided basically in two Mexicos, what I called in the book by Big Mexico and Little Mexico, a definition of a colleague here in Mexico. And basically, northern Mexico is more developed than southern Mexico. And one may think that this gap started just a few years ago. And that is not correct. What I show using the first population census in 1895 is that 130 years ago, the South already was the region that was lagging behind all the other regions in Mexico. And that gap has not closed down in our recent history. And the problem is that in the last 40 years, if you look at data from INEGI, the Statistical Institute, about income per capita, actually the North has grown okay, but the South has not grown or even decreased. So the gap now is even larger than in 1980. So many people probably know the Zapatista movement in Chiapas. Well, let me tell you, Chiapas is poorer now than what it was when Comandante Marcos raised in arms. So what is the problem with this? Well, if our growth pattern is the same as the last, the same as the the one we had in the last 40 years, then obviously our gap is going to increase even further. I mean, what I argue in the book is that this gap, you cannot see this gap in the US. The US, the South in the US is poorer than the rest, but if you look at the statistics, it's not as poor in relative terms as you can see in Mexico between North and South. Even Germany, West and East, or Italy, North and South. There is no example that you can compare Mexico with in terms of regional inequality. So what I argue is that, well, if this pattern continues, I mean, when are we going to start saying as a society that we don't want to live in this country, we don't want to be united, because the public policies the northern states need probably are going to be completely different than the ones that the South needs. And if the public policies are so different and the money you need and the money you request is completely different, then the pressures to keep the country together are going to be high. Probably not right now, but what I argue in the book is that let's think about the in 50 years or in 100 years, then the pressure is going to be too high. So I think the inequalities we face, especially the regional inequality, is the biggest threat to national security in Mexico.
So you'd have not only nominally two Mexicos, but actually two different countries.
Exactly.
If we don't do anything about it.
Exactly. That's correct.
So what are we going to do about it?
Yes. So in the book, I start with this discussion in the book that so when I went to college to learn economics, it was common that the discussion in the policy circles and in academia that you needed a country needs to grow first, and then we think about redistribution. That was the consensus. And I think the empirical evidence we have in the last 20, 15 years is that that paradigm is incorrect, that we need to shift our focus. We need to do both of them at the same time. We need to grow, but we need to do inclusive growth, and we need to redistribute much better, because if we do an effective redistribution, we are going to grow much more, and our growth is going to be more stable. And my reading of the literature and what I try to transmit in the book is that, I mean, to get inclusive growth, you need to do a very good redistribution. Doing a very good redistribution is going to be very good for growth and very good for poverty reduction. So this paradigm that was in the 1980s, 1990s, I think now is proven to be incorrect. And what do we need to do with this to do this redistribution correct? Well, I think we need the state needs to play a bigger role than the one we have right now in Mexico. Mexico has one of the lowest tax revenue in terms of GDP in the world, and we need to increase that tax revenue, and we need to spend that tax revenue in effective redistribution. And what I argue is basically improving opportunities, fighting discrimination, fighting inequalities along the life cycle. And so we need to think together on what types of discrimination we have, how can we reduce them? And what I argue in the book is that these inequalities are not going to decrease just with time. I mean, we need to act now, and the way to act now is with the state. And using the state, it can reduce these inequalities much faster and much effectively.
So, as we know, or people that study Mexico know, the obstacle in this argument is that there is very little willingness to increase the power of the state in terms of redistribution, in terms of increasing taxes, and in terms of giving even trust to the public sector, right? What do you think needs to change there so that we could expand the role of the state to address these problems?
Yes, so Mexico, what I call the book is like a vicious circle, meaning that the government doesn't want to push society to pay higher taxes. Society accepts this because they don't trust the government, but then the government doesn't deliver good public services with high quality because it doesn't have the resources. Then society doesn't want to give more money to the government because society thinks that the government is going to use that money to win elections instead of spending the money in proper investment, public investments. And I think these concerns are valid. And if we want to convince society to pay higher taxes, I think we need to do several things. No? One is we need more fiscal transparency. Fiscal transparency meaning that, as in other countries, as in the US or France, we need to know who is paying and how much they are paying. If we want to discuss a fiscal reform, of course, we need the numbers first on who is paying and what are they paying. Because if we don't have that, well, it's very hard to say something with substance about this debate. And in Mexico, we don't have fiscal transparency as in other countries. Two, I think depending on this answer, I think what we know from the OECD, the fiscal progressivity in Mexico, meaning that the amount of taxes the rich pay compared to what the poor pay in relative terms, the tax progressivity is not as high in Mexico as in other countries. This means, this means that we can increase our tax progressivity as a means to convince other people to chip in as well. So I think it's impossible to pass a fiscal or to discuss a fiscal reform without discussing how much more the rich are going to contribute. It's impossible to separate those two conversations. So we need to have that discussion. And then the third is in order to convince society that those funds are going to be used in a proper way, what I argue in the book is that we need to start discussing a professional bureaucracy, civil service, career path within the government. Because now at the federal level or at the local level, what happens is that the government is basically run by the political party that won the election. And you want that the government, or you want to convince society that the government is not going to use those funds for the political party. So I think it's crucial that we start moving towards a more professional bureaucracy along all levels in the Mexican government. So I think those three ingredients need to be discussed to increase tax revenue in Mexico and to increase the presence of the state to fight inequalities in our country.
We know that the current administration is not willing to have a substantial tax reform. Do we wait until the next one comes, or what do we do in the meantime?
Well, one of the motivations of the book actually is that in the last 10 years or probably 20 years in Mexico, we have discussed too much, I think, in my opinion, too much about conditional cash transfers, not increasing tax revenues. And I think that approach is wrong. And one of the motivations I wrote the book is try to inform Mexican society that that path is not going to reach a substantial decrease in the inequalities we face every day. So we need to start thinking about different things and start doing different things. So those two options are complementary, but not a substitute of what I'm saying.
And going into this information part, because part of the book argues about informing the public appropriately about these inequalities, right? This is one of the objectives of writing a book about it as well. But it includes a study that we participated in together that discusses the assumptions or the perceptions of the public about inequality, right? And we find that Mexicans are actually quite concerned about inequality, and they know that inequality is fairly high, but that they are not necessarily willing to pay a lot to get rid of it. Can you say a little more about that and how we square that with this demand for a bigger state where they would have to chip in, definitely?
Excellent, Alice. So what we do here in that paper is that we find basically that Mexican society are aware of how unequal our country is. They do want a country more egalitarian. However, there seems to be a confusion on how to get there. When we ask them, are you willing to pay higher taxes to get to this level? Mexican society on average say no. They want lower taxes. And what we think is happening is two things. One is that people overestimate how much taxes they pay. They think they pay too much when they don't pay that much. And the second is that probably they think there are many rich individuals that you can tax, and from that money you can do the redistribution. but they overestimate as well the number of rich individuals and the percent of rich individuals that are in the country. So that's probably one of the mechanisms why we observe that. However, we cannot disregard another potential channel that probably because all this discussion in the 80s and the 90s is that growth by itself is going to reduce inequality. Maybe people think that you need to grow and inequalities are going to decrease by magic. And we cannot discard that mechanism. But I think those are the main channels in which explain how people think we can get more money or how people think we can reduce inequalities in Mexico.
So there's a threat about perceptions of inequality throughout the book, or in several parts of it, right? Because also the section that talks more about discrimination, as you mentioned already, there is a perception problem in society that these issues are not as important and that they're not as prevalent. And what you, together with the other colleagues, show is that, in fact, they're really big structural problems. And you're very creative in your approaches to some of these studies. For example, about interview situations or rather job application situations where there's a discrimination on the basis of physical appearance, on the basis of gender, on many other dimensions. Could you say a little more how that connects or feeds into other inequalities like the ones we mentioned already?
Yes, so people may think that okay, you just need to work hard to get out of poverty, and you just need to work hard to get rich, and it is okay. I mean, of course, we need if we are middle class and we want to be rich, of course, probably if we win the lottery, we need to work very hard and be very creative, but there are some things that we cannot control. And people usually think that we have under control all our life and our economic outcomes. And what I show in the book is that discrimination avoids, or discrimination does not allow you to do what you want. So, as similar as in other countries, I do these studies where you vary the picture in the CV and you send the CV to companies, and then what I find is that basically the CVs that receive more callback are for white women, not for the brown woman. When I do this in terms of obesity, the woman with the normal BMI gets more callbacks than the woman with overweight or the woman that is obese. So, of course, these aspects play a role in the labor market, and they shouldn't play any role. But in Mexico, it's still legal to include or to request a picture in the CV, or to include or request your marital status in the CV, for example. So what I argue in the book is that we should eliminate these aspects. But then, I mean, you can work very hard, but if you are obese or you don't have the looks, then some jobs are going to discriminate you, and that's not fair. That affects everyone in society. Why? Because probably if I work very hard and I'm very good at this, then I'm going to be more productive than other people, and if I'm more productive, I benefit everyone. But if we are not choosing this person, then everyone is hurt. And not only that, and economists are are not aware of this as sociologists in the structural part. But what I argue in the book is that, okay, if I am a woman or I have specific physical characteristics that I know I am going to be discriminated in the labor market, then I am going to choose a different occupation. Then I'm going to self-select into different occupation, and that is very bad for efficient outcomes. And then even if I am not discriminated in that occupation, but I think I'm going to be discriminated, then it's going to affect my decisions on which occupations I'm going to choose. So that's another channel how inequalities, particular discrimination, affects everyone in society, and we need to get rid of those.
And there's another aspect in a part that I particularly like about the book that is on the care system or lack thereof, where something somewhat similar occurs as well, where women self-select out of the labor market if they have been in the labor market before, once they get children. And one of the reasons is that their income is a lot lower, even a long time after they gave birth to their kids, in comparison to how it was before. So it's not, in quotation marks, worth it to rejoin the labor market. Could you say a little more about this problem here and what's specific about this problem in this context?
Yeah, so this motherhood penalty has been found in many countries, and I did a study on the motherhood penalty using administrative data for formal sector workers in Mexico. And what we find is very similar to what has found for other countries, mainly that women and men before pregnancy have very similar outcomes in the labor market. But once pregnancy arrives, the woman starts to leave the labor market. And if they return to the labor market or stay in the labor market, they switch jobs with a lower salary. And this pattern cannot be recovered, or it's not recovered even 6 years after the pregnancy. So it's very the motherhood penalty is permanent, basically, and this has been found as well in other countries. I actually do this analogy with. So tell me, Alice, if I'm pronouncing correctly with the Rabenmutter. Yes, in Germany, that is the crow mothers, where they are stigmatized because they leave the nest, they leave the baby or children under different care, and that is not very good, or it breaks the social norm that you need to keep you need to stay with the baby, you know? And I think part of this motherhood penalty part is social norms that say that the woman needs to stay at home, and also probably it's discrimination. So in Mexico, for example, the most common complaint in the labor market is about discrimination in pregnancy. So we are not sure this penalty why it occurs, because it's very hard to know if it's social norms, if it's self-selection of women that really do not want to stay in the labor market. It's very hard to separate those. And the discrimination part is very hard to find or to calculate how much of this gap is due to discrimination. But I think those are the main channels. And that's another example why discrimination affects everyone. Mexico has one of the lowest female labor force participation in the world, and we could be much better off if we allow more women into the labor market. And for that, there is not only, as I said at the beginning, it's not changing one thing. We need to change many things, because some women that are young or that are relatively young and face a pregnancy, that helps those women, but we also need to do other type of stuff for other women that have children already. For example, an efficient and secure transportation system, security in the streets. So we need to do many different things.
As Tony Atkinson said at some point, that in inequality, everything depends on everything. The obvious question then is, where do we start? I mean, you give some answer to that in the book, but maybe going a step back, what was the reaction of people when they read the book? Do they get on board with it? Are they willing to do something about it? Or what have you perceived so far about this?
Well, I have received very good feedback about the book. I think people like the book. I think I faced one, two criticisms which I think are correct. One is that they would like to know more about the political economy in Mexico and how to implement many things of the many public policies I discussed. I mean, there is an element of political economy, of course, and I don't discuss that much. And I think that is correct. No, I think that is correct because I don't think it's my one of my strengths,
Yet.
this issue, but maybe in 10 years I can know much more about that and discuss that in a future book. The other is that, um, at the end of the book, I make a discussion on how to change things. And maybe I could have discussed more these issues on national security to raise more alarms about that. Probably they are right. Maybe I could have improve that part to make the argument more convincing. I think it's convincing already, but maybe
I
I
agree.
could have, I could have that part. And well, one issue that has been discussed as well is that in the book I don't deal with the consequences of the environmental issues and the inequalities people face in these matters. And not because I think it's not important, but because I'm not an expert. I don't write about environmental economics. But maybe in 10 years, I know more. So I think there is still things to write, and I hope someone with more experience in environmental economics and inequalities could write a book about that. So I think those are the three main criticisms I face. I have faced.
You definitely cover a lot of ground in there already, and you have to leave something for the next book, which we're waiting already. Raymundo, before we come to close, could you say something quickly about what motivated you to go into research in these topics in the first place?
Yes, so I am from a small town in northern Mexico, and when I was a teenager, movement started, and for me it was a big surprise that there was this thing in Mexico, this insurrection. I mean, I was 15 years old, and I was like, how come this is happening? I mean, we live very nice here. So how come other people in other parts of Mexico are not happy with how we are living? And understanding that at a young age, I think is very important. And for me, it raised a concern that, of course, every city in Mexico faces inequalities, but looking at these large inequalities that were showing in TV when the Zapatista movement started were very stark. And for me, it was a call of attention and reasoning why this occurs. And then I went into an economics major, and I really liked the social science part of it, plus the statistics and econometrics before that. So at the same time as the Zapatista movement, there was this major crisis in Mexico known as the tequila crisis. And this was very hard for my family. You know, we had the Zapatista movement, and then what was happening with my family. My father lost his job, so it was very hard. And I think these two things really marked my teenage years and really marked my thinking for the future in studying inequalities, in studying why economic crisis or economic booms don't affect people equally, and why some benefit and why some lose, and understanding that, I think, has been a key driver in my thinking and my research. So then I study economics and econometrics, statistics, the social science part of it. And I was in love with studying welfare and why welfare differs across people, across countries. And I think I continue to do so. So those are basically the drivers why I study what I study.
We're certainly very happy that you did get into these subjects. One of the foremost inequality experts in the country. We hope that you'll research it a lot more and you'll delight us with new books about it. And we hope that we'll have you again here in a couple of years with your environmental political economy book on these subjects. Thank you very much for your insights.
No, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you, Alice, and with all the audience. And I hope they enjoy the program. And I'm happy to answer questions that may arise with my comments in this program.
Well, you hear it. You hear it. Contact Raymundo if you have any questions, or let us know if there are comments. We thank you very much for your attention. We hope you liked this episode and would like to join us again next time for another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, hosted by Traces.Dreams. And we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good afternoon and see you. Bye-bye.